Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. It's very nice to see you all. I'm Poonam Yadav. I'm ACM-W UK Chair and Lecturer at University of York, UK. Today, my co-host is Anastasia Nezhrova, Project Coordinator at ACM-W UK Chapter. I'm really excited to invite our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Chubb. She's postdoc in Computer Science Department at University of York, UK. And Jennifer is going to speak about AI futures and interdisciplinary approach. And this presentation is our first presentation in our series. We are calling it Flavor of Computing. The idea about this series is that we would like to give a flavor, what are the different career options you can choose within the computer. And computing is not just sitting down in front of computer and writing code. It is something more than that. There are different to make computer science work and computers work. There are different other jobs, different kind of role, and which are some of them are very exciting roles, like that requires lots of creativity and everything. So I hope you will enjoy this presentation, and without taking much of our time, I would like to invite Dr. Jennifer to start her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Poonam, for inviting me and for this opportunity this afternoon. Is that showing what I wanted to show rather than a picture of the cat?
Yes, I can see the picture of cat.
Excellent. Okay. And is that in full view? Are you seeing the screen as a full?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, super. Okay, so many thanks for the invitation. My name's Jen, and I'm somewhat interloper in computer science. And I was talking to Poonam, one of the things which we thought would be interesting to do, as we say, with this Flavours of Computing sessions, is to show that actually computing, and indeed many fields, are increasingly or rather multidisciplinary, and we're seeing a range of different backgrounds and academics from different areas working in particular thematic areas. And so I'm going to give you my sort of walk through of a little bit about me, a little bit about my background, and why I found myself in the computer science department as initially a philosopher. And then I'll tell you a little bit about our labs in which we work, the digital creativity labs. And then I will just walk you through some issues around interdisciplinary working and multidisciplinarity, some of which relates to some of my previous work. So I've actually done research into interdisciplinarity. And then I'll give you a flavour of our current project, which is an interdisciplinary project looking at views about where AI is taking us over the next 20, 30 years. So it'll be a very small snippet of that project, but I'll be very happy to take any questions or follow up further. So I hope this will be of interest to a range of you. So yes, so this is me. So my initial first degree was in philosophy, and I would say that I liked empirical data a little bit too much to stay within the purity of philosophy, and moved more in towards thinking about applied ethics, and particularly thinking about moral philosophy, and was always drawn by thinking about what current views are on science, what current views are with relation to particular issues, and therefore it made sense for me to move more into the empirical area, and my PhD was in social science. However, I now sit in a computer science department, which we can come back to, as I said at the beginning. So my first degree, as I say, looking more at ethics, but then moved into my PhD, which looked at freedom, so scientific freedom and epistemic responsibility in science. I was supposed to impact agenda, so how we're increasingly expected to, as scientists or researchers, and I might use those words interchangeably because I think that's much more of a progressive way of thinking about science. is that we were thinking about the ways in which science and society interconnect, and the impact of gender in higher education is one such tool which asks us to think about, what the reach of our research is, who it affects and how it affects them. And that also includes scientific cultures themselves and interdisciplinarity across those cultures. So that led me into my first postdoc at the University of Sheffield, which I looked at science policy there, particularly looked at impact of emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence and others, and also around research policy as well. So again, coming back to this issue around cultures, we were looking quite a lot at the REF. Many of you will be familiar if you're in academia. We were looking at responsible metrics and the uses thereof, and something called the S4D4C project, which was a European project about scientific diplomacy. So it's quite a range of backgrounds here, and it's important for me to say that this was actually in the education department at Sheffield, but we were situated in an interdisciplinary unit there as well. So I was working with a range of people in politics and science itself as well there. That took me into my current PDRA role at York, which is looking at AI futures, as I mentioned before. And some of this talk will mention some of our some findings from a previous paper that we put out with Dr. Claire Ingham and Claire Boardman and Professor Marion Ursu, who directs the labs on generating impact from academic research and experience from our impact hub, which is DC Labs. And it's worth saying that impact is seen to be one of the main drivers for interdisciplinarity. So we'll come back to that, and perhaps that's why I've ended up doing so much of interdisciplinary working, is because of my interest in impact. So, as I say, we're focused at DC Labs. For those of you who are not familiar, this was a 5-year EPSRC funded grant, a large grant to bring together a range of different disciplines. So in our lab, just to make it real for you, we have computer scientists, we have people like me who look at the implications of those technologies, like in sociology. We have people in archaeology looking at digital humanities, educationalists developing games for gaming grammar. We have individuals working on AI, and we have people from theatre and interactive media and storytelling. A big part of our lab is also looking at games and gamification. So a whole host of different range of interests and a whole host of different range of methodologies, I would say, as well. Most of the projects are working in silos. However, we are encouraged, and where possible, we are seen to interconnect those silos. And so whilst, and we're going to come back to this, whilst some of the disciplinary norms are upheld, a lot of it crosses boundaries when it comes to thinking about how we can generate impact, if you like. So our current project, which I'm going to return to in a moment, just to give you a little bit of a flavour, is an interdisciplinary project. So you can see here, me and Peter, Professor Peter Cowling is a professor of games in AI, AI and games rather. And his background is vast, and he was actually the PI of the AI Futures project, and his vision was really to think about, okay, he's worked for a long time on the tech side of developing AI in games and in other domains, but he has an increasing interest, as many people do actually, within technology, of thinking about its implications and thinking about its impact, but does not have the background in the social science. And so together we combine our sort of expertise, data, and Peter's pulling in that technology background. And what we're doing with that project is we're principally gathering interviews, and we were going to be running future scenario workshops, but obviously the pandemic meant that a lot of this has had to go online. And the idea is to gather views from leading academics, decision makers and thought leaders in order to think about what we actually want from AI in the future. But also crucially, as part of the DC Labs, to actually generate some creative output as well as academic output, and to think about future avenues for beneficial AI research. You can see us here, we were talking at a public engagement event, and there's a little robot in the middle there called Neo. Some of you may have been associated with or know of the Neo robot. It was very limited in what it had to say, but a lot of the audience were quite surprised and had a lot of views on just its very existence, as you can imagine. So we see within interdisciplinarity actually quite a lot of opportunity for public engagement as well, because we're bringing that richness of the data as well as the technical expertise. Now, I mentioned to you before that I used to work in science policy, or rather I still feel that I do to an extent. And when we think about cultures, and one of the things I want to mention in my talk is very much around how we do this, it's important to acknowledge that this has quite a long narrative history of there being sort of two cultures of science versus art, or arts and science, and sense of polarization. And this dates back to a rather unhelpful lecture that C.P. Snow gave in the 1950s, which is where he was describing the two cultures in the scientific revolution, suggesting that intellectual life was on the one side being split into these two groups, where you had literary individuals on one pole and scientists on the other, and that there was a gulf of mutual incomprehension between the two, and particularly the young, which is again a very unhelpful phrase there. So this was very contested at the time, and rightly still is, and is still actually brought up on many occasions, and many, I'm sure, of you will be familiar with it. And I, in fact, was very much contested as a natural scientist from F.R. Leavis, who was a scholar and a literary scholar, who came back and said that this was absolutely. And so we had the two kind of sides of the coin engage in a debate about the value, if you like, and the ways in which people might engage with the different disciplines. That's a debate that you know, as I say, has set the landscape, if you like, but it kind of it riffs off the feeling that there is always these paradigms of research, which indeed there are, the pure and applied research, and there's a middle ground in between. But a lot of scholars have looked at modes of research. Gibbons, for example, looked at mode 1 of research, which is more pure working, versus mode 2, which is where you're starting to collaborate and create more impact from your work. But you also have Vladimir Bush, talking about these applications of research. So there's a lot of research and a lot of literature in this area, but increasingly what we're seeing in more common discourse now around, since the ref and since more, you know, sort of clear pushes toward interdisciplinarity, is that actually that mutual space in between science and arts and humanities, for example, at two poles, is where the most creativity will come. And indeed, the ref case studies that were developed for the first round of the Research Excellence Framework, which is the way in which universities are assessed on their excellence, actually showed that most of the impact stories came as a result of interdisciplinary working. And there's a nice diagram from Stephen Hill, who runs Research England, which shows this very issue. So that's setting the debate. And of course, as I'm trying to sort of suggest, my argument would be that actually it's that place in between, it's that collaboration which might generate more impact, might generate more ideas, and bring us about into less of the two cultures and more of a 2x2 cultures where we're working together. We did a little bit of research as to how people felt about interdisciplinary research in the lab, and we have a few quotes here. I think it's worth saying that defining it is rather unsettled, and these are just anecdotal comments from colleagues, but you can see that the broad sense is that you're sharing perspectives across a range of different backgrounds, being challenged and taking techniques. Many people preferred a sense that actually it may be better to use things like multidisciplinarity. So actually where there's a lot of disciplines working alongside one another and taking outputs from another discipline as they go. So I think there's a sense that sometimes people feel that if they're not necessarily entirely blending and using one another's perspectives to the full, that they would err towards using multidisciplinarity. And again, the quote on the right hand side says the same sort of thing about where you might see groups of disciplines within a particular cluster, say computer science, for example, then working with HCI, etc. So there's these levels of granularity that are really important, but I think fundamentally interdisciplinarity is about bringing different technical backgrounds together, bringing different research paradigms together as well, and sharing those perspectives, perhaps lending off one another's methodology, and learning more as you go along. And certainly Peter and I have had very interesting conversations about the ways in which we approach research and data, and it's been an interesting sort of a sharing experience for him and also for me. I'm fundamentally more a qualitative researcher as a guide, so that's very different obviously to thinking about even quant surveys. So where's this background coming from? Well, we are increasingly being led by external motivations, such as through the REF. Funding bodies are all about interdisciplinarity and to build esteem through it. And you can see here some screen grabs from UKRI's website, which is where they're talking about there being various studies into interdisciplinary research. They have the British Academy focusing on it, the Global Research Council, HEFGI and MRC, and the Academy of Medical Sciences, all looking to think about team science, how we cross paths with one another, how we build and review the ways in which we look at citation-based approaches. So this is a huge driver, but of course, you know, there might be an internal motivations that perhaps either impede or develop our ability to do this. Some of us are more naturally inclined to collaborate, and it might seem more sensible to do so. For others of us, we might prefer to keep the ideology of our discipline as a siloed discipline. And I think personality plays a big part here as well. So I would take away from my talk that I would encourage anyone to think about interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity and trying to collaborate, but at the same time, it has to be about how you feel is right for you. So I wanted to share a few challenges and benefits of working in an inter or a multidisciplinary way. So if we start with the challenges, for example, I think one of the things we found, and as I say, I've done some of my own research into this and also consulted with other members of the labs, and I think one of the big things is about perceived notions of what actually constitutes value to each of the collaborators or each of the academics involved. Because actually that might be practical things, or might be more to do with systemic issues. So for instance, what is valuable as a publication in computer science is not necessarily the same as social science. Authorship might not be the same in terms of how many people are on a paper in different disciplines. Impact value, as we've seen through things like the REF, you know, it's has been very discipline specific. So what has been reviewed as relatively impactful in the humanities, for instance, might not necessarily get as much weight, if you like, pardon the expression, impact and weight, in the engineering and physical sciences. So we see that perceived notions of constitute value a little bit of a tension. That tension doesn't just come from individuals, it also comes from institutions, as they need to support researchers not to just play lip service to this. So it would be very easy to say we're doing an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary project, but actually just to have, you know, a couple of people maybe have their names on the grant, and then it's just a sole social science project. And I can very much say in our case that's not what's going on. But the institutions have a role to play there in ensuring that there are the incentives and the motivations in place for each party. We've talked about a clash of cultures. Literacy is a big one, speaking a common language, and the AI Futures project itself, actually, that this still remains a big issue. What do I mean by that? It's about speaking a common language. Even within our interviews for AI Futures, where we've been talking to experts, leading thought leaders around thought leaders around AI, asking them about what they feel is going to happen with AI over the next 20, 30 years. And some of those people are in what we might call the existential risk community, where they're really interested in you know, the big questions, the speculative ethics about what may or may not go wrong. And most of those people have backgrounds in philosophy of science or philosophy or perhaps psychology and consciousness. At the other pole, though, you may have people who are actually on the ground working on these things in robotics and machine learning. And actually, even just in our responses, there is a big difference there in the ways in which they spoke about each other's disciplines and the way in which they felt that there needed to be a more interdisciplinary approach to even AI features. So I think this, and many commented that they felt that on many occasions it was difficult to get that kind of discourse going and an understanding of what each other were working on and what were the priorities. We've mentioned paradigms, and there's something here about thinking about what excellence looks like in each domain, and then how silos might be quite hard to break, and sometimes we might pull in different directions. But on the flip side of that, as I mentioned, I think impact is probably one of the major things that I would probably be suggesting is a main benefit of working in this way. Because as I mentioned at the start, the AI Futures project, for instance, its impact as a social scientist on my own, well, I could have probably some influence in policy because of some connections. I might be able to influence through a little bit of public engagement, but would I have the acumen to develop technology, creative output, maybe even a game? Absolutely not. And through this project, through DC Labs, that is potentially a really clear output for our project, and therefore a greater reach and an upskilling of myself as a PDRA, and a mutual sort of learning experience. So I think that's a really big one. Some areas have a natural synergy. For example, there might be some particular areas where you see real benefits there. For example, you may see geneticists working with philosophers on matters of identity and informing policy. There is more access to ideas and collaborations I've mentioned. You may get some esteem for it. Academic communities tend to applaud it. You may get funding for it. In the case of AI, for example, we can't build trust into systems without considering the social context within which it operates. And so I think, again, this is something that, that's why I want to relate it back to our project quite a lot. And dare I say, we might enjoy it, which I certainly do. So I've mentioned before that there's a big driver here for interdisciplinarity in science and society. This is just a handful of current papers, very recent papers, apart from the one on the right is actually an older book, which was a paper rather that was put forward by James Wilsden, who was my professor at Sheffield, who wrote about the public value of science and how that needed to come through this kind of dialogue between science and social contextual research. But you can see here you've got interdisciplinarity, research by numbers. This is where they're thinking about the analysis of how we bridge disciplines. There's something about interdisciplinarity and evidence for impact. And then actually, if you see at the bottom, because I know it's very small, should we discipline interdisciplinarity? So again, how do you define yourself? That can be a problem, actually. Do you call yourself an interdisciplinary researcher and leave it at that? Or do you need a domain within which to sit? I would say I'm an undisciplined social scientist at the moment. So there's a little bit about interdisciplinarity, and I'm quite happy to talk about that in a little bit more detail, but I'm really conscious of time. So I want to tell you a little bit about our project. I said to Poonam I would give you a flavour of the AI Futures project, just to raise a little bit of awareness. So currently we're doing the analysis. So we're not that far into it. It's about 10 months into the project, but I have conducted around 25 interviews with thought leaders in AI, and we will then go on to look at talking to policymakers and technologists, and indeed hopefully some publics as well. This is a piece of artwork that we actually commissioned some artists to just act as a provocation really for the project. It in itself is an example of working along different disciplines, I guess. Now it's not to provoke as such a negative or a positive response. It's really just to ask our participants to think about the ways in which they might live better, for example, or happier, or thrive more with AI in their lives over the next 20 years. You can see that this picture is split. You can see the dog there is sitting and very much in the moment, having a nice time, and he's having his tummy tickled. On the right hand side, you've got a person who's got a lot going on, not necessarily negative. necessarily positive, but there is a lot of input there, and there are things, technology is at the heart of that person. And we ask, you know, you can see actually there's a little bubble where they are still thinking about the fact that the dog's next to them, right at the top. We are asking really, you know, is there a role for AI to play to make us a little bit more like the dog on the left? Is there a role for us to make our lives happier? Is there a role for AI rather to make us happier? So that's a provocation. The design of the project is twofold really. I started with comprehensive mapping of research concentration in AI futures. So you'll see that a lot of the research effort is based around sort of existential risk community, thinking about moral philosophy. You have people looking at decision making, you have people looking at social justice issues. You also have people looking at AI in particular, AI features in particular domains, as well as in stories and narratives as well. And a lot of that research effort is based in Oxford and Cambridge, but in Edinburgh and in other pockets of different universities across the UK and globally. The Future of Humanity Institute, for example, being one over in the States. So I had a look at that to see what was going on, an ongoing analysis of the media and indeed science fiction. So I had to watch quite a bit of fiction to see how this was being portrayed, as you can imagine. And that in itself is very interesting for how we actually go forward. We'll be thinking about you know, public perception and how we build trust in systems. We do need to fight, or at least acknowledge some of the narratives that are out there. And indeed some of the findings so far really do speak to the need for more nuanced stories and narratives around AI futures, rather than just necessarily polarized distinctions. But we can come back to that. So I've carried out these interviews online. We're using thematic analysis, so this is just a deductive and inductive coding, and we're aiming for some data visualization of this, this data, perhaps through a game or even interactive narrative itself. The mapping I've just mentioned to you, and I'm aware of time, so it's just I can send all of this detail to you, but it's a nice little bubble diagram. You can see my technical skills here. This is why we need the computer scientists. You can see here reflected some of the themes that are coming out from the AI Futures institutes that are around the globe, and these cut across a range of domains of use, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. Throughout these interviews, I would say that most of the experts we spoke to represented a range of different expertise. So we've got people in machine learning, computer science, data science, through to philosophy of science, psychology, music and the creative arts, and of course robotics as well. I pay particular attention to thinking about gender representation in light of STEM gender issues, but also because we know, and this is reflected in the data and the interviews themselves, that the AI community itself and that of the existential risk domain, as I said before, those people who are looking at philosophy of science tend to be male, tend to be white, and so it was thinking about ensuring that there was representation of diverse voices as much as we could for the project itself, and we've managed to achieve that. But those issues are very, very deep, and come out richly in the data that we need to be thinking about, including more diverse voices in both the design and its implementation of AI. And so we asked them, really, if we choose carefully, where do we go and how do we think about balancing risks and benefits? The main themes I would just like to say to you at the moment are looking around. So we'll have some data on dominant narratives around AI. We have data around the role of media and the hype, around how these stories are propagated. There is research into the likelihood or nearness of AGI. A lot of our research reveals interesting findings around creativity. A huge area is around responsible development of AI and ethics, and the need for thinking about ways forward in terms of a roadmap for thinking about ROI, and the values that we'd want to see embedded in a future with AI, and so there's very much concerned with ethics and that kind of those kind of considerations. We have thoughts on robotics, the portrayals and perceptions and how those influence dominant narratives. And then finally, as I've mentioned, very importantly and crucially for this group, thinking about diversity, representation and equality. So that takes us to half an hour. It gives you a little bit of a flavour, I hope. I'm happy to discuss any aspect of those as we go through, and I'm quite happy to take any questions. I'll stop sharing my screen for you.